Hey everyone, so One Piece chapter 1033 just came out, a chapter I would have greatly enjoyed if not for people constantly sending spoilers at me, which upset me for 3 reasons. 1, don't spoil me. 2, don't spam spoilers in comment sections of my videos because then you're just spoiling everyone else. And 3, the reason people were trying to spoil me was to prove me wrong about Zoro and Enma, as I titled my most recent video, Zoro is not Enma's master, which is funny because it shows you didn't actually watch the video. The video was specifically about how Zoro has not mastered Enma yet, and how over the course of the King fight, Zoro would need to master Enma. This chapter does raise the question as to whether or not Enma is truly Zoro's sword just yet. There is actually an opportunity for a story to be told for Zoro earning Enma. This fight provides an opportunity for growth for Zoro, and the growth may very well be related to actually making Enma truly Zoro's sword rather than Oden's. The greatest duel of his life might be the one where he does truly earn the most important sword. And guess what? Literally all of that just happened. Most people just didn't watch long enough to actually get to that main point of the video and just reacted to the title. So if you're gonna come in to tell me I'm wrong and spam the comments in my Twitter feed with spoilers, at least just watch the video so you don't completely miss the point and don't potentially spoil a bunch of other people for no reason in the comments. So besides that, I think the chapter itself, 10 out of 10, no question. I really like this chapter. I think let's just take it from the top. First of all, before we talk about Zoro, let's talk about King a little bit, because King has really impressed between the previous chapter and this chapter. I think that nobody would have guessed that King could have just tanked, Ashishi Sonson the way that he did, because from everything that we've been seeing from King, fire-based abilities, very fast, mobile, speed, even some level of stretching abilities, which he showcased again this chapter, and of course, a lot of cutting abilities, both with his wings and straight up like sword-to-sword swordplay. On top of all that, he just has, I guess, one of the most durable bodies that we've ever seen in One Piece, because, Sanji, of course, he's out there tanking, a hit from Queen directly with Queen's sword, but King just took one of Zoro's best cutting attacks, in his arsenal, arguably probably Zoro's go-to attack when he's trying to cut something that is extremely dense or hard to cut, right? I would never have expected that out of King. Not because we couldn't have expected King to be a really strong character, but just because it seems like another thing on top of everything else that he already has. He's proving very quickly to be one of the most versatile fighters in One Piece in terms of his, power set, and definitely even among the first mates. He's got a very wide range of abilities. We talk a lot about how Katakuri has such a wide range of abilities, but King has, really changed my view of him over the last 2 chapters. Even just the fact that he can self-destruct on command, I suppose, or we don't know if it's triggered by Zoro actually stabbing him or hitting him, but he was really flexing on Zoro throughout this chapter. Just everything Zoro would try to do to him, like, he had multiple open attacks against King, and nothing affected him. So I hope that we get to see Ashura over the course of this fight, as I do feel like Ashura could be one of the few things that can actually get through to King. Ashura, after all, it cut Kaido. So I would be very shocked if it can cut Kaido, but then even King is somehow, King is even somehow, impervious to it. So definitely looking forward to how Zoro can actually take on King and make this somewhat of a fair fight. It feels like, obviously, by the end of this chapter, Zoro's taken his first step in that direction. Beyond that, we get to learn a little bit more about King's race, so I don't know if all Lunarians are going to be, the absolute monstrous powerhouses that King is. I would still assume that King is probably, even among the Lunarians, one of the stronger Lunarians you could possibly be, just because King, after all, we know he's one of the few survivors of the race, because it just doesn't make sense to me that a race like that could ever be wiped out, right? A race that can, has such a wide range of abilities and just such ridiculous strength and durability. So whatever took out the Lunarians, I still feel that it was the world government. If you think back to one of the videos I dropped a little while ago, I talked about the Oni race, and in that video I also talked about what I believed happened to the Lunarians and the Three-Eyed Tribe. But, we'll discuss that again later when we get a little more evidence. So I think Lunarians, very interesting. Also fun thing to think about, which is that Sanji's fight, we did cut away from it, right? But actually it seems to have picked up right where we left off. Right after Sanji launching the Hell's Memories, because we see Queen emerging from some rubble, and Queen referencing the fact that Sanji had just spoken to Zoro on the Den Den Mushi. So it does seem like these 2 fights are happening very much simultaneously. Something a little interesting that I don't know if it's going to end up happening, but it would be really cool, is if Zoro and Sanji's fights let me backtrack for a moment. So Zoro's fights, normally Zoro and Sanji fights, like Oda likes to do the full story of the fight for one of them and then move on to the next. Usually Sanji first, then Zoro, right? Think back to Jaibura, think back to Mr. 2, think back to even Kurobi. You get the full flow of the Sanji fight and then the Zoro fight. But with both Zoro and Sanji, they both had really good, introspective character chapters, right? Before then switching over to the other guy. And normally you would expect kind of Sanji to get his, character moments and then Sanji to finish out his fight and then Zoro to get his character moments and then finish out his fight. But as far as we can tell, Zoro's been getting his moments, Sanji's been getting his moments, but neither of their fights have wrapped up yet before moving on to the next one. So I wonder if we're set up for a, scenario where Zoro and Sanji might finish their fights in the same chapter, if Oda kind of wants to play up the Zoro-Sanji dynamic even more in a way that we haven't seen so far in the series, and just have the conclusion of both their fights be like, a big double climax chapter. I think that'd be really cool to see, something that, hasn't happened before, but Oda is kind of going back to the Zoro-Sanji dynamic a lot in this latter half of Onigashima. So, besides all that, let's talk about Zoro, alright? So, this fight, I think, is the first fight since Mr. 1. Really, this whole fight is giving strong Mr. 1 vibes, because just the way this chapter is starting out with, Zoro having to find both his swords, Sandai Kitetsu, he has to grab that, Wado Ichimonji, he has to get that, and, one of the things that I talked a lot about in the Zoro mastering Enma video, right, one of the main things that I harped on was, that was in full force this chapter, was that Enma did not feel right to me as Zoro's sword just yet. I did not feel like it was truly Zoro's sword just yet, because Oda did not write a story for Enma. Right? The swords that Zoro had gotten in the past, Wado Ichimonji, Sandai Kitetsu, Shisui, the most important swords in Zoro's arsenal, there was always an important story for Zoro to get those swords, to really earn those swords. And that was even showcased this chapter. Like, Oda has such hyper awareness of his usual trends of how he writes the story, that he referenced that this chapter, he reminded us that this is how Zoro got Sandai Kitetsu, this is why it was so important, this was the moment that Zoro earned that sword, this is how Zoro got Wado Ichimonji, this is why it was so important, this is how Zoro earned that sword. I liked getting those flashbacks because it gives some perspective and reminds us that Enma is clearly different. Right? Zoro has not yet earned this blade. As of this chapter, Zoro is even talking about how Enma to this point is still testing him. Zoro has not yet proven, like with those other swords, that he is worthy of that blade. And then we get to go into, this is even a further parallel to the Zoro versus Mr. 1 fight. Then we get to this flashback with Shimotsuki Kozabaru. I might have pronounced that wrong. I might have mixed up a couple vowels, but that's the pronunciation I'm going to run with for the rest of this. Shimotsuki Kozabaru, Kuina's grandfather, in the Zoro versus Mr. 1 fight, Zoro was thinking back to the flashback that he had with Kuina's father, right? Koshiro. My bad. He was thinking back to the flashback of Kuina's father, right? And what Kuina's father told him. In this fight, Zoro's thinking back to Kuina's grandfather. So such a strong resemblance in how these two fights are playing out. He's trying to find these swords. He's having these sort of like introspective moment. He's thinking back to what he learned from the masters at the dojo. And in, a weird way, from what I remember, the realization that he had with the Mr. 1 fight was he had to learn how to have a sword, like a sword that could only cut nothing is the sword that could cut anything, right? That was kind of the conclusion. And that was a much, softer view on swordsmanship, but it got him to where he needed to be, which was the ability to cut diamond. Or not cut diamond, getting ahead of myself here, but cut steel, right? This fight, Shimotsuki Kozabaru is telling him something that's a little more aggressive in a way, which is that swords are killing weapons. They're meant to cut. They're meant to kill. If you can't handle that, then you're not ready for the sword. That's where this myth about cursed blades seems to come from. And Zoro having that realization, which is kind of on the other end of the spectrum, that's what's helping him be able to master Enma. That's what gets him the realization that, look, I was worthy of these past blades, but I was not worthy of Enma just yet. And then that leads him to the conclusion, which is kind of, it makes sense now that you think about it, which was, many people were wondering during the Oden flashback, why was nothing made of Oden and Enma, right? Why is it that Enma was such an easy sword for Oden to wield, but for Zoro, there's this big deal that's made out of it that, sucking haki out of him initially, even now during the fight, it's sucking haki out of him. It's because Oden, he would never even had that problem, because Oden from the start, we know Oden's past, his childhood, etc. Oden's just always been this monster that there would never have been a point where, Enma would have been taking the haki out of him, because Oden's just always letting out, I guess, enough haki that that's never going to be a problem. So from my understanding, and I can't tell quite if that's like this is the perfect translation for it, I'm trusting TCB scans here, but it sounds like the problem was that Zoro was maybe running out of haki or not able to put in enough haki into Enma by the end of the fight. And that's why, because I guess as Zoro's spirit was fading or whatever, Enma starts sucking out his haki because Zoro's not showing Enma that, look, I can match up to what you're demanding of me. And what Zoro kind of realizes that, okay, if this is, if this is the only way, then this is the only way. And he just keeps pumping more haki into Enma. That's at least my understanding based on the last few panels of that chapter. And in doing so, we get Zoro doing his first use of, I guess, traditional Conqueror's haki. Obviously, Ashura on the roof, not even on the roof, Ashura from all the way back in the Kaku fight, that has always been Zoro using Conqueror's haki. It's interesting that Zoro has been tapping into haki in many ways before Luffy ever even tapped into haki. But that's a discussion for another day. But, everything seems to point to that being the case. So anyway, Zoro at least uses, I guess the traditional use of Conqueror's haki for the first time that we've seen in the series here, with him knocking out a bunch of fodder. The favorite traditional go-to use of Conqueror's haki, which is knocking out fodder or taming animals, right? So, knocks out those guys. I think from the statement that he had of like, when, King questioned the release of the Conqueror's haki right then, I wonder still if Zoro's even aware of what he just did. So I think that it's still ambiguous as to whether or not Zoro definitely knows that he has Conqueror's haki, because he was confused when Kaido asked him, and he was confused when King asked him. Both times it does not seem, you could argue it both ways. You could say that maybe Zoro's just playing dumb with Kaido. Maybe Zoro's just taken aback by King's question. Maybe both times he knows that he's using Conqueror's haki this entire time. But I still just question it. I feel like it's very possible that Zoro does not know that he has Conqueror's haki, and that's one of the reasons why Ashura, to this date, it only comes out in such select few situations when his spirit is pushed to its absolute limit. So it's not something that it seems like he can call on a whim, because otherwise I feel like he would have used it against King already, in my opinion. But, that's still speculative. Maybe he's aware that he's been using it, and just for whatever reason, he just doesn't use it that frequently, and he kind of is playing dumb with Kaido, and is just surprised with King's question. But regardless, Conqueror's haki, first time, normal use by Zoro, ends any and all debate, I guess, about whether or not, if there was a debate or anything like that, I don't think there was. I think Kaido kind of settled that when he mentioned that Ashura is Conqueror's haki, but if there was a debate, it should just be over now, right? And finally, Zoro and Luffy, the last couple panels. So I like to think that Zoro is referring to Luffy in both of these statements, my captain and my oldest friend. He could be referring to Quina as one of those two statements, because he mentions promises that are made. So, promises plural, so that could mean promise to Luffy as the captain and promise to Quina. However, we only really got a flashback of Luffy. Maybe Quina is just supposed to be, obvious to us. Quina would probably be Zoro's oldest friend. I don't know if Zoro ever considered her a friend or just purely a rival, so I prefer to think of Luffy, because, Luffy was, as far as we've seen in the story, Zoro's oldest friend. Zoro was 100% a loner, as far as we know of, until he met up with Luffy. That was the whole point of him meeting up with Luffy and then slowly learning to, care about this person's dream even above his own, even though initially he was so single-minded in his goal of becoming this world's strongest at any cost. And that was pretty much all that he cared about. So I like to think that Luffy is his oldest friend. And even just the fact that Zoro's saying promises, well, that can be interpreted maybe as the two promises that he's made to Luffy, because he did make that promise that we saw in Shellstown, that we got the little flashback of, that, world's strongest swordsman, if you can't even be that, then I'd be embarrassed as the Pirate King, so that promise. And then also after Mihawk, Zoro's defeat, and Zoro saying, I promise I'll never lose again, is that okay with you, Pirate King? So maybe he's referencing the two promises that he's made, or the multiple promises he's made over the years to Luffy. I just think it's a lot stronger if Luffy is the person being referenced in both those cases, because it just means so much more, right? It means so much more because we've seen so many times how loyal Zoro is to Luffy, how much Luffy means to Zoro, how much Zoro is willing to do for Luffy. But Zoro's also not just very open with his feelings to the point that he would express that Luffy is also, he's not just my captain, he's not just this person that I'm putting on this pedestal, that I'm pledging my loyalty, allegiance to, etc. He's also, my oldest friend, right? That's something that's, funnily enough, despite everything Zoro has done for Luffy, he has never said something like that. I don't think that's a little, that's a little more emotive than we would expect from Zoro, a little more genuine than we would expect from Zoro. And I'd love to see it in this fight, in this context, when he's got his back against the wall, because ultimately that's who he's doing it for. And it's good to remember that, like, their relationship at the end of the day is not just, Luffy's the captain and then Zoro's doing everything he can to help his captain along the way, but rather Luffy is also Zoro's oldest friend, probably the person that he's closest to in the world. So I think at the end of the day, the Luffy-Zoro relationship, it had a nice little chapter added to its book with this chapter, and I definitely hope to see more of that come out over the course of, the rest of Wano, because I do think that Zoro is not quite done yet, even after the King fight, if Zoro is to defeat King here. I think that there is more that he can do to support Luffy by the end of this. So I might put a video on that out next week. It might be the Brook video instead that I was planning to do this week, but I'll figure that out later. I won't bore you with that. So that's all for this video. If you enjoyed, then definitely like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll talk to you all next week.